Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
The interview series Reflections in Time was begun by the late Professor Paul Borghi more than 20 years ago. This new series continues Paul's work and is dedicated to his memory. My name is Jack Newton. I'm retired now, but I'm still active as a professor emeritus. I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960, and I served for 30 years as dean, or 20 years, as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I worked closely with Professor Borghi in the development of his original interview series, and I can think of no more fitting tribute to him than to continue this work. Well, we have a very lovely day in late May. The year is 2004, and I have as my guest today Mr. Gary Carrico, who retired fairly recently, just last December, as Vice Chancellor for Business and Finance here at UNO. Gary, welcome. We're glad to have you with us here today.
Thank you, Jack.
Now, I said you're currently retired, but and I again said that was quite recent. You've only enjoyed about a semester's worth of retirement at this time, right?
Yes, December 31 is when I retired.
Yeah. Okay. So that isn't very long at all. Your memory, at least for recent events, ought to be pretty good. Let's start in talking about you a little bit. I know that you went to higher education institutions in Kansas. Is that where you're from? Did you come from Kansas? Or?
Yes, I'm from a small town in north central Kansas, Beloit, Kansas. Actually not far from the Nebraska border.
And you were born and grew up there?
Yes, yeah.
And went to secondary school there, I presume?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Then actually I went, my first year of college, I went to Wichita State University and then transferred to the University of Kansas and got my bachelor's degree in accounting from the University of Kansas.
And that was what year?
Well, I like to tell everybody what era I'm from. I was a classmate of Wilt Chamberlain's.
Oh, okay.
It was 1960.
Yeah, well, that's real basketball country down there, isn't it?
That sure is. Yeah.
I saw Wilt once. I couldn't believe how big he was. Yeah. So you got your B.S. in accounting in 1960, and you got that with some distinction. I guess that was with honors in your field.
Oh yes.
And then I presume you took the CPA exam.
Yes, in Kansas you can take the CPA exam the semester that you are graduating, and so I took it and passed it before I graduated.
Okay. So you were all set to go in the business world then in 1960?
Well, except you have to have experience to go with the exam to get the CPA certificate.
Okay.
So I joined a CPA firm in Kansas City.
Okay, yeah, I was going to ask you that because I know you didn't come to the university here until the early 70s, so tell me a little bit about what you did in between from the time you graduated until you came here.
Well, I did quite a bit of jumping around before I came to UNO. When I got my degree from KU, I went to work with Pete Marwick, now KPMG, in Kansas City, Missouri.
One of the big accounting firms.
Yes, spent 5 years there.
I take it that was pretty good experience.
It's a great experience. I think it's the best experience you can get, and I have a son that's now a CPA with a CPA firm here in Omaha.
And okay, so you did that for some years, and then you went on and did some graduate work?
Yes, I felt that I wanted to go either into university administration or university teaching. Talked with my professors at KU, and they recommended in the accounting field at that time that UCLA was probably the best place, which, like many others, I felt I wanted to try living in California, so I went out to UCLA in the doctoral program in 1965.
How'd you like it out there?
Well, UCLA was fabulous. Just loved UCLA, but we did not like living in LA. My wife and our oldest daughter was just a year-old baby then. They were both sick with pneumonia the first 8 weeks for openers.
Oh my!
And the daughter was sick the entire year there. So after one semester, I dropped out of the doctoral program and gave up a teaching assistantship to take a job in administration at UCLA in the budget office.
Now you said that you decided that you were interested in working at a university. What's stimulated that interest?
Well, I enjoyed my time at my undergraduate work at University of Kansas as well as Wichita State, and I liked the atmosphere, and I felt that was an atmosphere that I would like to work in.
Were you, while you were there, exposed to business operations and accounting and the sorts of things that you ended up doing?
Yes, in fact, I was very fortunate the short time that I was there. Chuck Young was Vice Chancellor for Business and Finance at the time, and Chuck, some short time after that, became Chancellor at UCLA. I believe he was 36 years old at that time, and I think served as Chancellor for about 25 years. And in fact, the Chancellor who was Chancellor at the time was Franklin Murphy, who had been Chancellor at KU when I went to school there.
So
I was very fortunate to work with some very extremely good people.
Yeah, and that makes a big difference, I'm sure.
Yes.
Well, then you came back to Kansas when you left, or to Missouri, I guess, the University of Missouri at Kansas City, when you left UCLA.
Yes, I actually lived in Kansas in Johnson County as I had when I was with the CPA firm, but moved from UCLA to the University of Missouri at Kansas City as administrative assistant to the chancellor.
And then, let's see, you continued your graduate work there?
Yes, I finished up my MBA. I had, as I say, I started the doctoral program at UCLA, but decided to go into administration, for which I didn't need the doctorate necessarily. And so finished up my MBA at University of Missouri at Kansas City.
And did you it seems to me you had another title at UMKC.
Well, I was also Director of Institutional Studies.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to think of.
And while I was there, we moved the budget office into my office also, so I was also in charge of budgeting.
Wow, so you had lots of good experience in that area, too.
Yes, I did, and being the administrative assistant to the chancellor, it gave me a tremendous opportunity to really see all facets of the university administration, and it was a great experience.
I'm sure that helped later on.
Yes, certainly did.
Especially when you moved here. And then, after you got your MBA, and I'm trying to remember that too. You had some distinction in that when you got that degree too.
Well, between UCLA and UMKC, I had straight A's in my graduate work. Yes.
Yeah, that's not an easy accomplishment, I'm sure. Some of those courses are pretty tough. Okay, and then you went to KU again?
Yes. Shortly after I got my MBA, the controller position opened up at KU, and of course, always have been, still am very fond of KU, and so I went back to my
Now, for the
alma
benefit
mater.
of our audience who may not be familiar with the word, what's a controller?
Controller is primarily in charge of all the accounting operations, the financial administration. The financial part of business and finance I'd break down into two primary areas. The controllership function being in charge of accounting, cashiering, and those administrative functions. The other side being budget, developing of the budget and working with departments on their budgets.
And I remember when I first came here, the business officer was Harold Kiefover, and I don't know whether you knew Harold or not, but he always had the title controller, I remember, when he was...
Yes, Harold then became Vice Chancellor, and I actually came here as Assistant Vice Chancellor for business and finance and worked for Herald for 3 years.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right. I should have known that. I was thinking he left earlier than 1973, but he didn't. He was, he was an interesting person.
Very, very, another really good person to work with and learn from.
Yeah, I worked with him a good bit. It was interesting. I don't know whether you've ever heard this story or not, but I was the first one to bring, first faculty member at any rate, to bring a federal government contract to the university.
I hadn't heard that.
And I brought a contract from the National Science Foundation here, and this was in the early 60s. And at that time, the university had no provisions for working with a federal contract. Nobody knew anything about it. And so I worked with Herald quite extensively, and the people at National Science Foundation were a little bit amused. We had no audited overhead figure for the university, so they didn't know what to put in that column on the contract form. And so we charged everything as direct costs. And that cost a few smiles in Washington,
oh, yes.
Sure. We didn't have any overhead. But that's how I got to know Herald very well, because we had to work out all these details together. And he was very, very helpful. He was a great person to work with, at least as far as I was concerned. So you were controller at KU, and then you didn't stay there though?
Went back to Kansas City one more time. Actually, at the time that I was controller at KU, it was probably the worst time to be controller at KU. It was the late 60s with all of the student riots around the country, and KU had more than their share. $1.5 million bombing of the student union, which I was, it's a separate corporation, which I was treasurer of. A couple of murders on or near the campus, and in fact, I was standing 24-hour guard duty around my business office when my wife was in Kansas City after having just had a baby. So those were very not real pleasant times to be in university administration, so I decided I would get out of university administration and try the business world.
So where'd you go?
I went back to Kansas City, Missouri as controller of Commerce Properties, which was a publicly held company, a spin-off of Commerce Bank Shares, controlled largely by one of the two Kemper families, very prominent families in Kansas City. Again, it was a very good experience, but I found Commerce Properties was a real estate holding company, held a lot of, or owned a lot of downtown Kansas City, Missouri real estate. Very large in terms of assets, but very small in terms of people in the organization, about a dozen people in Commerce Properties. And after having worked with the university, as you can imagine, it was quite a change in terms of, I really missed the interaction with the variety of very interesting people you have in the university, and so I decided to get back into university.
Decided to look around and see what it was available, huh?
Yes.
And so that should just about bring us to Omaha.
Yes, I was looking to get back into university administration. At the same time, wanted to stay within a few hours of Kansas City and my hometown in Kansas. All of my family and my wife at the time later died from cancer, but she was a native from Kansas City. All of our families really were in Kansas City and my hometown, and so Omaha. And my wife, in fact, had lived in Omaha when she was single and had gone to school at Creighton and taught school here in Omaha. So it was geographically a very good fit, and when I interviewed, I was very pleased with what I saw.
So it was just luck. There was a job open here as what was assistant, you mentioned it a minute ago, assistant vice chancellor for business and finance.
Yes, yeah.
And so you worked in that job for a few years.
Yes, for 3 years. Yeah.
For 3 years, and that was with Herald as your boss.
Right. Yeah.
And who was in the office back then?
Well, obviously, one thing I would say, several individuals. I would say that back in '73, that was only 5 years after UNO became part of the state system. had experienced a significant growth in that 5-year period of time, and I think the administration hadn't really had time to grow with it and you know, develop the was badly understaffed, in my opinion. The real strength in the finance area was 3 female CPAs who were hired just a year before I came. Julie Totten, Ramona Klassmeyer, and Margaret Zion. I was a little troubled that there was no one in business and finance who had experience at any other university. And so in developing in business and finance, I hired first John Moore from the University of Texas at Dallas.
John.
And then when I went through when I became vice chancellor, it was a national search. There were 2 finalists. The other finalist was Howard Cottrell, who at the time was controller of the University of Miami in Florida, had been controller at the University of Michigan. And when
Those are both pretty big jobs.
Yes. Back when he left here, he became controller of the University of Washington.
Wow.
But when I became vice chancellor, my position became open, so I asked Howard if he would be interested in coming in as, changing my title, coming in as controller, and so I hired Howard in. So I had someone with University of Texas experience, someone with University of Michigan and Miami experience, in addition to having a little background from a couple of institutions myself. Which made it was very helpful in terms of developing policies and procedures.
Bringing in the experience that you gain at other places is always important, I think.
And on the facilities side of business and finance, about a year after I became vice chancellor, the facilities director left and went to the University of Montana, and I was able to hire in Ed Bogard, who was at the time facilities director for the medical center. So again, getting someone who had done the same job somewhere else.
I knew a couple of those. Well, you mentioned having the 3 women CPAs in the office. 2 of those, Julie and Ramona, I got to know very, very well. Julie was when I first became dean, and it was right about that time, it was about 73, 74. I couldn't have done my job without all the advice I got from her. She was absolutely terrific.
And I've heard many people say that. Julie is now, as you know, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Finance, had been for several years working with me. The 2 major areas in business and finance are the finance side and the facilities side. And I mentioned hiring Ed Bogard from the medical center. Ed then hired, Ed's assistant Ed Rice went to become Assistant Vice Chancellor for Facilities at Kansas State. And so Ed hired in Neil Morganson, who then was teaching engineering at Iowa Western. Neil later became, when Ed Bogard moved to Michigan, Neil became Assistant Vice Chancellor for Facilities, and Julie Totten, by that time, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Finance. And without those 2 people, I'm sure I would not have stayed here 30 years.
Neil was absolutely tops. Unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago. But, very
2 years ago last month.
And but I got to know him very well because we worked on the development of what's now the Durham Science Center together. And we met with the architect together, and we had, all kinds of things of that sort that really made that building, really made the project go.
Well, I said for many, many years, Neil had one of the toughest, if not the toughest jobs.
Just dealing with the public and land acquisition was. Well, because he and who was it before him that dealt with those same problems?
Rex Engerbretson.
Yes.
Yeah, we had at that, when Rex was here, campus planning. When I came, campus planning was a separate operation from business and finance. While Rex was still here, we combined the 2 positions to Director of Facilities Management and Planning.
Well, both of those people, both Rex and Neil, had a gift, I think, for meeting with the landowners and other people that were concerned about what was going on, and keeping things calmed down pretty well.
Well, and not only that, but even internally with the facilities director, as you well know, being Dean of Arts and Sciences, which probably is really the toughest job on campus. but all of faculty members or deans and everybody has complaints about the facilities, and so you're dealing with just about everyone on campus and it's usually with respect to a problem. And Neil was very, I think, outstanding at working with people, solving problems for them.
One of my biggest regrets is that I was never able to interview Neil Morganson in this series, because I'm sure he would have had well, wonderful stories to tell, among other things, but he would have been he's part of the history of the university that I'm sorry we missed, and if it wasn't for that sudden heart attack a couple of years ago, that I asked him a couple of times if he'd come in for the interview, and he'd always say, well, I'm really busy right now, but we'll get around to it. We never did.
And Neil always was busy, and he kept his finger on every project going on in business and finance.
Yeah, he was very helpful to me too. We've been talking about the different aspects of the job of Vice Chancellor for Business and Finance, and you've done a good job of outlining but I don't think that most people know. Certainly people not associated with the university don't, and I doubt that even people closely associated with the university, most of the faculty members have no idea, I'm sure, how big a job you had. I mean, it just boggles the mind sometimes. It includes not just accounting and budget, but all the personnel aspects of the job, hiring and firing people, business operations like purchasing, and the telephone system, and the information systems, the computers. Physical plant, obviously, we just talked about. The new buildings, the maintenance of the old buildings. We've got lots of things to talk about today.
You left out the most fun area to be in charge of at UNO.
What's
That's
that?
Parking.
Parking, yes, indeed. Well, I was going to get to that when we talk. I mean, you worked with land acquisitions. You worked with, and that's what we needed for some of the parking problems. We'll have to talk about the acquisition of what we now call the South Campus, I guess, the Exarban property. Well, before we finish today, we'll do that. And then you've got all the interactions with government agencies that you've got to know about. Grants and contracts, I mentioned briefly. Things like safety, where you've got to know the OSHA regulations. Personnel, where you've got to be dealing with equal employment opportunity and affirmative action. All of those things are, I know you have other people in there to do the detailed work for you, but you've got to, you're the one who's ultimately got to be responsible.
Well, I'm just going to say the toughest part is making sure you hire good people
right.
that are familiar with
That's true of so many jobs.
But it is true, you do have to get involved with a multitude of different areas.
Well, with all of those things I've run through, it's quite clear we have lots of things to talk about today.
Well, one thing I would mention, too, when you're part of a university system, in many areas, but particularly business and finance, you also have the relationship with the other campuses.
Yes.
And most people would probably think that, well, business and finance and all the campuses is the same. They all do the things the same way. And the job would be much easier if that were true, but it's not. A lot of policies and procedures are different. Even the organizations are different. What is included in business and finance is slightly different from campus to campus within the University of Nebraska system. But I will say, too, that the business and finance organizations on all University of Nebraska campuses have, for 30 years, in my experience, been great to work with. We've always helped each other out. When I came here, having been in the University of California system briefly and the University of Missouri system, things weren't always that friendly on those campuses. And of course, here we had our differences. We all wanted more than our share of the money and lots of other things. But we always worked well together, I think.
Okay. Now, are there any aspects of the business and finance office where the orders come down from on high and central administration of the university says everybody's going to do it this way?
Well, yes, there are, and of course you were and still are familiar with the accounting system, which is one of the things that is uniform on all campuses.
Right.
Sometimes they say do things this way, and not everybody always does that. But the accounting system is uniform, and that's very helpful. Actually, I went through two new accounting systems in the time that I was here. When I came in 1973, the University of Nebraska had just installed a new accounting system the previous July 1. And in March of '73, when I came in, we hadn't yet gotten out the monthly statements for July of '72.
I didn't know whether to bring that up or not, Gary, but I was a new dean back then. And
actually, that is an excellent example of one campus helping another, because at that time, as I say, UNO was really understaffed. Hadn't really staffed hadn't had the opportunity to staff for the move to a state system, the growth in enrollment, and the multiplicity of the intercampus system. And right after I came in, talked to the chief accountant at UNL. He and his assistant chief accountant both came down and spent, I think, about 2 weeks at UNO working long hours, helping us get caught up. We weren't the only ones that were behind. Everybody was behind.
No, I remember those problems very, very well. And I remember that in my office, in the dean's office, we did our own accounting for several months along there, because that was the only way we could keep track of where the money had gone.
Right.
It was fun. But eventually everything got straightened out.
Yes, and I think for many years UNO has had an outstanding accounting staff. In addition to Julie Totten, Joe Hebner, controller, who also was with KPMG, had been the manager in charge of our audit for many years, and lots of good people in the finance area.
So let's go back to when you first came to UNO. Was there anything particular that attracted you to Omaha? I'm sure that that there were other jobs open around too that you might have been looking at.
Yes, although, like I say,
you said it was close.
Geography, yes, geography had a lot to do with it, and the fact that my wife was familiar with Omaha and had enjoyed living here before.
Okay. We talked about land acquisition and the way the university's grown. What was the campus like back in 1973 when you first came here?
Well, I think we had something like 8 permanent buildings. We had a lot of houses. You will remember well the Quonset huts.
Oh, yes.
That, primarily women's athletics operated out of the Quonset huts. I played many of basketball game in the Quonset hut myself, with several of us in business and finance. We organized a basketball team and a softball team. Played the med center many times. In fact, one year I hired a 610 grants accountant who had just graduated from Wayne State from a basketball scholarship, and that took care of our basketball games with the med center. But probably the most enjoyable part of the 30 years has been all the campus. Well, the people are the most enjoyable thing, but something that I really have enjoyed is the campus development over that time.
You want to spend a few minutes here outlining just what that development was? There were some, I know with the Diamond Jubilee, there was a huge change in the campus. But
yes, I would say probably the 3 major physical developments over that 30-year period. The Diamond Jubilee certainly was the first one and the most important one. The South Campus, obviously, very important, and then the development of housing. Without the Diamond Jubilee, housing would never have been possible. As you know, we still are landlocked and have always operated on a very, very small acreage, which made parking impossible. But we also, again, with that growth that occurred in the first few years of UNO becoming a state university, didn't have adequate space for offices. We, as part of the Diamond Jubilee, which is something that Neil Morganson and I and others worked with Del Weber on.
That was Diamond Jubilee, of course, is our 75th anniversary of the founding of the university.
Yes, which I believe occurred in 1983.
83, right.
Yes. And Del put together a package with our input, with input from the community, and we developed a plan to enhance. Well, first we acquired 12 properties to the west, which, as you mentioned in relation to Neil, was not fun.
Right.
But we were able to acquire those 12 properties, which gave us a little breathing room in terms of, enabled us to develop some additional surface parking to the west. But rather than just add some parking, as you recall, UNO at the time was primarily black asphalt parking lots,
right.
Almost right up to Dodge Street.
Right.
We developed this Diamond Jubilee plan to replace the asphalt parking lots with concrete parking lots and with nice landscaping. We took them back from Dodge Street, added green space on Dodge Street with berms. The Kiewit Company Foundation gave us the parking garage as part of that Diamond Jubilee. The Durham Science Center was also part of that Diamond Jubilee. And we also at that time developed a circulation road, which made a major difference in the campus. Prior to the circulation road, the only way to get from one place to another on campus was through a parking lot where you already had students sitting there waiting for, trying to find a place to park. We developed a circulation road and the concrete parking lots, which really, I think, was the beginning of the tremendous landscaping that this campus has developed quite a reputation for. I know every time anyone from another university is on campus, they marvel at the way our campus is.
It is indeed a
developed.
beautiful campus. But of course, in the early days, back when I first came here, it was a beautiful campus too, back in 1960. And who was it? It was Clarence Leffler, I think, who was in charge of the campus then. And his predecessor was the man who was city planning director for so long, Alden Oust. And they did a beautiful job. Of course, we had all that space. We didn't have Kaiser Hall. We didn't have the Business Administration Building. So we had that huge space in front of what's now Arts and Sciences Hall, and that was that just set the campus off very nicely.
Well, and of course, the difficulty, you probably had adequate parking at that time too. But
no, we never had adequate parking.
Okay. I was going to say, with the growth in the campus, we had a problem that every time we were able to add a building, it had to go on an existing parking lot. So
yes.
You eliminate part of the parking that you have. And with no extra land anywhere.
Yeah, even back in 1960, President Bale would always say that when you get your parking permit, what that really is a hunting license. You're permitted to hunt for a spot. Well, this must have been a big difference between the UNO campus then and your experience at KU, for example.
Well,
where you have a huge university.
It was, but I would say it was a very positive difference because the way I have described it, at most of the large universities, you tend to get a lot of empires built up around the place. UNO was small enough, and still is small enough, that I think the working relationships are much closer. You work, I think, much more closely, at least in my experience, with the people on campus, academic and non-academic.
Well, that's been my experience. I mentioned already that several of these people that you worked with in your office, I often worked very closely with too, and I never met a single person that wasn't extremely helpful to me. Maybe there were a few of them around that I didn't get to interact with.
Glad to hear that.
We were talking about the people who were in your office when you got there. The one person, I said I worked with Julie very well, and I didn't know Ramona back then, Ramona Allwill, later Ramona Klussmeyer, but I got to know her very well when she headed up the business operations for our program in Pakistan, and we got to be close friends then because I worked in Pakistan for 4 summers.
Well, I had that same opportunity because right after that program was set up, in fact, it had been operating about 6 months. They had no accounting system.
Yes.
So Tom Gutierre asked me to go over. I thought I was going on a vacation. Went over there for 30 days and had to create an accounting system. And fortunately had taken Ramona with me. Very fortunately, because when I came to check out of my hotel, my credit card had expired, and Ramona had to pay my hotel bill. But you as you said, you've worked on that program, and it's certainly one of the greatest experiences of my life is working with that Afghan program. 30 days in Pakistan, mostly in Peshawar, which we call Dodge City, Pakistan.
Did you stay in what hotel? In the Green Hotel?
Well,
or in the staff house?
Tom had to give us the full experience. So the first time we went back and forth between Peshawar and Islamabad.
Yeah.
The first time he put us in Dean's Hotel.
Dean's Hotel.
Did you ever have that experience?
No, I've been there though.
Well, Dean's Hotel is in all the novels.
Right.
All the
goes
Afghan,
back to the British Raj.
Yes, and we had beds with little gas furnaces right next to the bed. And after the first night when I ran that gas furnace, we were there in January, although it wasn't real cold there. But I realized that was not very smart to leave that gas furnace operating next to my bed, so I just did without heat after that. But the second time we came back to Peshawar, we stayed in the Pearl Continental, which you probably...
A little different.
Yes, quite different. Yeah. And the really exciting things there was you go down to breakfast in the morning, which I'm sure you experienced, and you have a Dutch engineering team at one table and a French medical team at another table.
Yeah, that was a truly international experience.
Yes.
Yeah, that was fascinating stuff. I've forgotten how deeply involved you were in that. You know, I had the same thing happen to me. That's why I was there, because remember the director of the project from UNO had a heart attack and died quite suddenly.
Wayne Glidden, yes.
Wayne Glidden, and Tom asked me to go over and see if I couldn't set up some sort of system so that they could get through their first evaluation by the federal government. And you set up the accounting, I set up everything else on the computers over there.
I was there earlier, and they had no financial person in the budget, so they had no financial person over there. And as you know, there were four languages. I think it's Farsi, Dari, Pashto, and Urdu.
Yeah.
And so they had 6 months worth of invoices in these 4 different languages, and of course I didn't know a thing about any of them. But I took a secretary and a taxi driver and converted all those 6 months of invoices to English so we could get repaid by AID, and then set up an accounting system so we could account for them.
Yeah. Well, those were great experiences for me, and from what you say, I know they were for you too.
Absolutely.
But it was hard work. Only I was there in the middle of the summer, not in January. And the 125-degree heat is a little unusual, especially when the air conditioning didn't work because they didn't have the electrical energy to drive it. You know, one of the things that we've touched on here as we've been talking is the fact that you interact with a lot of other people. As the Vice Chancellor, you had extensive interactions, I'm sure, with the Chancellor and with several different Chancellors, actually, because...
Yes.
Yeah, and then with the administrators on the other campuses, we've touched on that a little bit. Certainly with the Board of Regents, we haven't talked about that too much. And I don't know, with the legislature, too, did you get involved with
yes,
budget discussions?
Particularly earlier, say the first 20 years, got very closely involved with the Appropriations Committee. More recently, Central Administration has been handling those duties primarily. As a means primarily to reduce each campus going in and making their own individual cases, making more of a University of Nebraska solidified approach to working with the legislature, which makes sense.
Right. Well, I know that you worked with as we've just mentioned, with several chancellors. And I'm sure they were all different. But in general, what was the nature of your interaction? I mean, what sorts of questions did the Chancellor ask you to answer, or what sorts of problems did you solve for the Chancellor?
Well, I think problems is probably the key word.
Yeah.
When you mention interaction with faculty and deans, 99% of the time it's a problem you're dealing with, and so you don't always have a real favorable image, because not everyone is always happy with the solution that we end up with. But I worked 4 years for Ron Roskins as chancellor. Came in a year after he did. I think he came in '72.
Right.
Worked 20 years for Del Weber, and then 6 years for Nancy Belk. And as you say, they're all a little different. Of the three, Del is probably more of a hands-off, you do your job, and not getting as deeply involved. Both Ron and Nancy got more deeply involved in business and finance. There's a very broad difference among them. They all, of course, have different operations, but different modus operandi. As I say, usually when, unless it's a matter of developing the budget or working on budget cuts or items like that, it's usually a problem that some dean or faculty member has gone to the chancellor with, and or problems from the public as well.
Can you give us a feel for what developing a budget is like, or is that too complicated to talk about in the time that we've got left?
Well, it is a little complicated in that it's different in different eras, different involvement of different people in terms of from one era to another. When I say different people, I mean the number of people that are closely involved. But it's primarily looking at in terms of the budget request, looking at your needs and looking what will reasonably sell in terms of legislative support or private support, and then trying to develop the rationale to sell that.
Is it hard to project what your income will be?
Well, yes, it was for many years. Again, the first few years I was here, UNO had difficulty with the student system and had over-projected incomes. We had to go through some budget cuts. And then, of course, later on...
if you think you're going to have more than you really have, then you got to figure some way to cut back on it.
Right. Of course, then in the 80s, the state had difficulties, as it has in recent years. So the budget cuts in the middle of the year are the toughest because everyone already has their plans made and commitments made.
Right, and the fact that so much of the budget is tied up with salaries, which you can't do much of anything about.
Right, particularly on the academic area, which...
that's a problem for deans too. So I don't know whether you know it, but one of the first things I did when I became dean was to go to the College of Business and take as much of their accounting sequence as I had time for. And so I learned the accountant's language and learned what some of the problems were, and that helped me a great deal in dealing with your office, among others. But at least I knew what I was talking about. I wasn't completely lost, the way I would have been otherwise.
Well, I've even found some College of Business deans that aren't always totally on top of things. But I mean,
one of the people that taught me accounting was an assistant dean at that time of the College of Business, Larry Trussell.
Larry Trussell, yes.
He was very surprised when he saw me in his class. But we had fun, and I did enjoy it. Always had lots of questions to ask.
Well, I had quite a surprise when I was teaching accounting at UCLA. Also, they gave me a teaching assistantship late when I arrived. In fact, after I arrived, I found out they took it away from someone else to give it to me. And my first day of class, after class, some woman came up from the back row and said, "It was my husband whose teaching assistantship they gave to you. So I'm going to audit your class and see if you're really better than he is." She dropped out before the semester was over, fortunately.
That would have been a challenge, wouldn't it? So we've been talking about preparing a budget request. Can we talk a little bit more about some of these changes that we started to talk about? We talked about the Diamond Jubilee, and you mentioned two others. You mentioned the student housing, and you and you mentioned the acquisition of the South Campus. Let's start with one of those. Let's take the South Campus. That's a good one. What did your office have to do with that?
Well, the South Campus was, of course, a gift from FDR.
And this is the old Exarban property, the
Yes.
racetrack and the associated parts of it. And FDR is First Data Resources that got it and then put up some office buildings and so on there.
Yes, and first of all, to have that occur, we had to develop a plan for how we would use the South Campus.
Mm-hmm.
And sell that, so to speak, to various individuals involved. And then developing the South Campus became very difficult because we didn't get any additional staff to do that, and particularly in the grounds area. As
Sure.
you know, there's quite a bit of additional land there. In fact, it's about the same size as this campus. Well, I think this campus is 88.5 acres, and that one's 72. So it really strained us in terms of managing the grounds, and we wanted to have it look as this campus
Sure.
looks.
And it
keep
does.
in
It
good
looks
shape.
very
Yeah.
nice.
It did give us a tremendous opportunity to add additional parking, which
Yes.
we did, of course.
And we've got shuttle buses running now and have for
Yes,
some
we
time.
developed. Well, we had previously had shuttle buses from Exarban when the whole area was owned
Sure.
by Exarban. For a short time after the Diamond Jubilee, where we added received the gift of the parking garage and added surface parking, for a short time we were self-sufficient, but that went away in a hurry with more increases in enrollment. So we reinstituted that shuttle bus, and then just this past year we negotiated a contract with Crossroads to add a shuttle bus from Crossroads, which, in addition to needing the space, also helped, because one of the problems in operating the shuttle bus from the South Campus is being able to get students here on time. Everyone likes to come
Right.
10 minutes before their class and make it to class. And during peak times, it's difficult to get everybody up here.
Right.
So having students coming from two directions instead of one made that much easier to accomplish that. So I think that has been a great move.
Yeah, now, there are some additional plans for using that South Campus. I've heard people talk about a new business administration building there. And did you get involved in
Yes,
that
I
sort
was
of
involved in
planning
that planning, and we have for quite some time planned on an additional College of Business building.
Right.
And that would be a tremendous asset, not only for the College of Business and PKI because of their interaction. It would also help parking substantially to move another large academic unit
yeah.
down there to where you have more students parking down there whose destination is down there, as opposed to parking and riding the shuttle bus. So I hope that comes about soon. Right now, of course, funding is very difficult to come by, but I'm sure that'll happen eventually. And like I say, my concern was parking, but the academic interaction between information sciences, engineering, and College of Business could really be benefited by moving them down there.
Now, the other aspect is student housing. Of course, that's involved with what we were just talking about, because now there's student housing on the South Campus, too.
Yes, and that housing was developed by the Suzanne and Walter Scott Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
We have leased the land. The initial housing on this campus here, actually, we do not own. Was developed by Century Housing out of Texas, which we contracted with, leased the land to them, and contracted with them to develop and operate the housing. And on the South Campus, that housing has been built and operated by the Suzanne and Walter Scott Foundation.
And eventually, that will, in both campuses, I guess, become university owned.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. But right now, somebody else has the headaches.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
And I hope there aren't too many headaches, because it's been a wonderful.
Well, I think it has worked out extremely well.
Yeah.
In developing that contract with Century, I was one of many that had a number of concerns. And in fact, we were able to make a lot of changes in Century standard contracts. They they operate housing, build and operate housing for a lot of universities, and we talked with many of them to learn what kind of problems they had, and we're able to get a surprising number of changes made to the contract, which helped us a lot.
Well, if our audience up to now has not understood much about what the Vice Chancellor's job is, just this discussion we've been having about negotiating contracts and finding out what other people's problems were and getting changes made and this sorts of thing, that should let people know that it isn't all just counting beans. It's a big job.
Well, as you say, I think few faculty really understand what all does go on in business and finance, and it is a lot of different functions.
Well, one of the things that I hope comes out of this, in addition to learning something more about the history of the university and about you as part of the history of the university, is learning something about that position that you held and all of the things that go on in a university that somebody has to think about and take care of, and it's not a small operation at all.
Right.
Well, I guess by some standards it would seem small, but there's a lot of work to be done.
It's a very complex organization, regardless of size. I think universities are very complex.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's see. What else haven't we talked about? There are so many things. One of the things that I was deeply involved in from the faculty point of view anyhow was the personnel area, because part of a dean's job is to hire, fire, and hope we don't do too much of that, but hire and promote and evaluate faculty. And all the other folks outside of faculty, outside of the academic area anyhow, were your responsibility. And personnel is a big job too, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And that's another area where you work with the other campuses and where you don't always have the same policies and procedures, which can create problems from time to time. But many of the policies are uniform. The fringe benefits in particular are handled primarily by central administration. As far as developing the conceptual products, we handle the details, working with individuals, explaining it, enrolling them, and so on. But much of that part of it is centralized for all campuses, which is really the only way to go in those areas. But then you have a lot of complexities in HR too, as you say, the firing and the discipline.
Yes.
Becomes more and more complex these days compared to, say,
and I know from my own experience and from everything that I've dealt with, that the university always took very, very seriously these the equal opportunity and affirmative action guidelines that are, and sometimes we didn't get credit for doing that, but also sometimes we had folks come up from Kansas City usually, or someplace like that, and conduct investigations, and we always came out on top of those. But those were, I'm sure, a difficulty for your office too, if in no other way than just providing all the information that you had to dig out.
Yes, and part of that has changed in recent years in that affirmative action has been moved into the Chancellor's office. So they now handle a great deal of that information development and the disciplinary procedures with respect to affirmative action.
Right. Well, if we ever made mistakes in those areas, they certainly weren't willful ones, because I know we tried awful hard.
Yes, definitely.
And I think we came out pretty well whenever we did have somebody challenge us.
Yes.
Well, let's. We've talked as we've been going along here. We're getting towards the end of this, believe it or not. I've been getting signals that we don't have too much time left, but we have a couple minutes anyhow. And we've talked as we've been going along about a number of people that were really important people in the university. You know, we talked about Neil, for example, and the other people in your office and so on. But I'd like to give you an opportunity, if we've missed anyone, and I know that's a tough one to pose to you, because you got to think back of all of it and see who do we talk about. But if you can think of anybody that you'd like to mention at this point, maybe give you the chance to do that.
Well, one person that comes to mind that you know very well, I've always felt at UNO that our relationship in the Vice Chancellor's offices, Academic Affairs, Student Services, and Business and Finance, has always been outstanding. And we've been fortunate to have truly good Vice Chancellors to work with, but also good staff members, and one who has been retired for quite some time that you know very well is Elaine Hess.
Yes.
She handled the business matters for the Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs, and we worked very closely with her. And
well, you know, Elaine had never been interviewed in this series, and when I first started doing these interviews, she was one of the first people I thought of, and she was kind enough to agree to do it, and that was a good interview. I enjoyed it.
Would like to see that.
Yeah, remind you and remind all of the people in our listening audience that that these tapes are available in the university library, and they're also available in the library of the Alumni Association. So one can go and sit down and look at them there, and you see all of these folks that that we've talked about. Well, not all we've talked about, unfortunately, but a good many of them.
So I guess I should have shaved this morning, huh?
Well, this will be run a couple times a week, and you'll be able. Oh, and I think that this is added quite substantially to the history. We're coming up on 100th anniversary. We talked about the Diamond Jubilee. We're about to have our 100th anniversary coming up soon, and this could be an important part of it. Who knows? Okay, well, this has really been an interesting hour, and it's gone by awfully fast. I wish we had at least 10 minutes more, because there are a bunch of things that I'd love to talk to you about, but I think at this point I'm going to have to just say thank you. And I've enjoyed talking with it and finding out more about the job of Vice Chancellor for Business and Finance. And I want to thank our listening audience for joining us today in a visit with Gary Carrico, a longtime member of the administrative team at UN Omaha. We've been taking a look at some of the history of the university as seen through the eyes of the history makers. And this is Jack Newton, inviting you to join us again in the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.